friends, thanks for joining me in this series on leadership potholes and how to avoid them. Today's topic is the anxious leader. Do you deal with anxiety much? It's an epidemic. The World Health Organization says that anxiety disorders are the most common mental health disorders worldwide. Can you think of that? Of all the mental health disorders, anxiety is the number one disorder. And it affects an estimated 264 million people around the world. And in the United States, 19% of adults, that's almost 1 in 5, and it would include about 40 million people, experience an anxiety disorder each year. That's 1 out of 5 people. And the problem is even worse with young people. 32% of adolescents aged 13 to 18 experience anxiety disorders. Whoa, where did that come from? And this all costs about $42 billion in the United States healthcare system every year. So this is a big problem. And it doesn't seem to be getting any better. So how can we in this video help you to make it better in your life? Well, what is anxiety anyway? It's defined as distress or uneasiness of mind caused by fear of danger or misfortune. You could also call it apprehensive uneasiness or nervousness. And it's a mentally distressing concern. You're concerned about something and it's distressing. In psychiatry, they call it a state of apprehension and psychic tension in some forms of mental disorder. So in many different forms of mental disorder, anxiety is a part of it. Synonyms would include disquiet, worry, foreboding, or fear. And the antonyms, the opposite of anxiety, would be tranquility, peace, serenity. Wow. And this is an interesting one for me because anxiety is not usually one of my biggest issues. I got some other issues, and in the course of this series on leadership potholes, I share a number of my issues. But anxiety is not usually one of them, but there are certain things that really do push my buttons. Jim Collins has a classic book called Good to Great. And in that book, he says, successful organizations put the right people on the bus, and they put them on the right seats in the bus. Well, that's one of my stressed out things, because sometimes in my life, I found myself on the wrong bus, it seemed like. The wrong job, the wrong career, the wrong path, the wrong organization. And there's other times when I was in the right organization, but I was on the wrong seat in the bus. And so if you are on the wrong bus, or you're on the wrong seat in the bus, you're going to experience extra anxiety. Another thing that I've discovered in my life is anxiety tends to come when I overschedule myself or overcommit. So in other words, there's no margins. Several years ago, I got this book in the mail. It's called Margin. It's by Richard A. Swenson, and I got it in the mail, and I thought I didn't order any book about this. It turned out Richard Swenson is Dick Swenson. He's a friend of mine from college, and he sent me his book. And I thought, well, that's nice of him. It's pretty cool. It looks like a good book. And a little while after that, Dick sent me a note, and he said, hey, what do you think of my book? And I said, oh, great job. Good job, Dick. And he said, did you notice that you were quoted in it? Well, he kind of caught me there. It was a little bit of a exaggeration on my part. I kind of leafed through the book, but I didn't really read it. And it turned out he quoted me a couple times. That was amazing. And so in this book about margin, he talks about the fact that sometimes our tank is empty. Sometimes we're overloaded. We're overloaded emotionally, physically, mentally, all those kind of things. And then it comes to certain times when our tank is empty. Boy, that's one of my problems. I give and I give and I give and I give, and then eventually my tank is empty. And yet people still are expecting things from me, even though my tank's empty. They don't know my tank's empty. And so we need to look on the gauges, just like you would on your car. You see when it needs an oil change. You see when the gas is about to run out. But sometimes we're not checking our emotional tank, our mental, physical tank, and we run out of gas. I remember a couple times in my life when I had multiple book projects that I was either writing or I was editing, and I'd committed myself to certain deadlines, and it turned out that they just weren't possible. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't meet those deadlines. Well, that's stressful. When you make commitments, you make promises, you tell people you're going to have it done a certain time. Sometimes I get a little overly optimistic about how fast I can do things. And so I had to meet with them and say, sorry, I just can't do it. Well, that's tough, but it removed some of the anxiety when at least I was honest with them. I also realized, and I've mentioned it, I think, in some of my previous videos, that I really need weekly, periodic rest breaks, Sabbaths, personal retreats, sabbaticals, things like that, to recharge my batteries and to get my tank filled up again. What about that? Do you have time to recharge your batteries and fill your emotional tank again? Because you don't want to wait until your car is totally out of gas and it's on the road someplace and needs towed. You want to catch it earlier than that. You want to see how the gauges are. So, are you aware of how your gauges are today, how your emotional tank is today? There will be extra anxiety if your tank is empty. Another thing that frustrates me is clutter. I have a lot of projects going on most of the time, and so I put them in stacks. I put them all over the place. And so my house, my office, my garage, tends to be all cluttered. Well, the interesting thing is I really, really, really like order. And yet I really, really, really produce clutter. So there's a conflict there. And it causes anxiety. I wish it could always be. Everything could be in place. I wish everything could always be spotless. Well, unfortunately, it's not. Well, here's another thing that I've discovered. You might have discovered this too. Most of the things we worry about are in the future. And most of those never end up happening. The things we worry about turned out to not even be an issue. They didn't happen. We shouldn't have even worried about them because they just were something that we feared, wondered about, and they never happened. And I learned during 2019, I had cancer, I went through chemo, and thank God I'm all done with all that. But one of the lessons I learned is the lesson that cancer patients and also people in recovery have to learn. It's the one day at a time principle. So in other words, if you look ahead and you say, wow, how many more rounds of chemo am I going to have, or how much am I going to have to deal with this to go into the recovery and all that, that's stressful. But if you say one day at a time, I can get through today. And my mom's favorite Bible verse, I think, was Matthew chapter 6, verse 34. And it says, do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Wow. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. So in other words, hey, I started telling people, a lot of other people deal with anxiety and deal with this same kind of stuff. And I said, you know what? I think we're going to make it till midnight tonight. And at midnight tonight, God's going to give us another infusion of grace, and we can make it to another midnight. But if you look ahead, what are we going to do weeks from now, months from now, years from now? How are we ever going to survive? How are we going to do this? That becomes a problem. So we can make it to midnight. How about that, my friend? Can you make it to midnight? I believe you will, most likely. So most emotional disorders, think about this, most emotional disorders are based either on traumas and offenses of the past, which we relive. We play it again on a loop, oh, somebody done me wrong, and I had this trauma, I had this bad thing happen, this unfortunate thing, and we just run it over again, the past behind us. Or we're worrying about possible challenges in the future. They haven't even arrived yet, and we're worried about it. It's taken all of our energy today because we're worried about the future or we're reliving the past. So tranquility is much more likely when we focus on the present. The present, God is present with us in this moment, and we need to get back to that present sort of thing. Speaking of God, I want to talk about what are the roots of anxiety, because in the Bible, there's really a clear beginning point when all this began. And it's in Genesis chapter 3, You know the story probably. Adam and Eve were in this beautiful garden. Everything was fantastic. They had everything they needed, all the food they needed, just a wonderful place. But the serpent came and said, hey, God's trying to hold things back from you. And if you eat this apple, this fruit, whatever, it probably wasn't an apple. If you eat this fruit over here, you're going to be like God. You're going to know good and evil, and everything's going to be so cool. And God had said, do not eat that tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But they did it anyway. And guess what happened? That's where anxiety began, fear began, depression began, anger began, unbearable stress began, relationship conflicts began. Adam threw his wife under the bus and said, hey, it's that woman you gave me. And Cain killed his brother. I mean, everything went bad after they did this. And what was the problem here? So think about the knowledge of good and evil. Don't you want to know good and evil? That sounds like a good thing. But the problem was, you have to read between the lines a little bit. What basically was happening is, instead of trusting God, trusting his provision, trusting his goodness, trusting his instructions, Adam and Eve now were basically saying, we can do it ourselves. We can be the captain of our own fate, the person that runs our own ship and does our own decisions. We don't really need God. We can do it ourselves. We can figure out life on our own without God. Well, no wonder they became anxious. No wonder we become anxious, because we might be a wonderful person, a smart person, an educated person, all that kind of stuff. But ruling the universe is beyond your pay grade, and it's beyond my pay grade. God has to run the universe. And when we try to take that into our own hands, it's going to cause anxiety because we can't do it. It's going to cause fear. It's going to cause all those other things. So when it really gets right down to it, then anxiety is kind of a control issue. You think, I'm not a control freak. Well, we all are kind of control freaks. We want to control things. We want to make our decisions. We want to hold on and feel that we can do it right, and we know what we want. We're going to get what we want. So if the root of your anxiety is control, which it very well might be, what's the solution to that? Surrender. You say, oh gosh, how could I do that? I want to hold on to the steering wheel. I know what I want. I got to get what I want. Surrender. What a powerful word. Surrender to God. And when you surrender to God and say, Lord, my present, my past, my future, it's all in your hands, all of a sudden, the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your heart, and serenity will come. You've probably heard of the serenity prayer. People in recovery like to say it a lot. I think it's a cool prayer. It says, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. We can't change everything. We do not rule the world. We do not have everything on remote control and we can just make it happen. So help me to have the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can. There's some things you can change, and quit complaining about everything. Just make the changes that are hard or difficult. The conversations are hard or difficult, but make the change. Courage to change the things I can change, and the wisdom to know the difference. Boy, do we need wisdom. So that's where anxiety came from. It came from trying to do it ourselves, trying to be on the throne of our own life instead of God being on the throne of our life. I saw an extreme, really, even to this day, it breaks my heart, an extreme illustration of this. I was in a Methodist summer camp, just a week-long camp, and in the middle of that week, the guy who was the CFO, the guy that handled all the finances, committed suicide. And you think, whoa, what happened there? Well, what happened there is that he was embezzling money. He was taking money from the camp and from the different places that he worked, and he didn't want to face it. He didn't want to face the music, so he just said, I'm just going to end my life. You see, misconduct can cause anxiety. He was engaged in misconduct, and it caused anxiety because he realized he couldn't cover it up forever. If you're tend to be a liar and you've told a bunch of lies. Well, that causes anxiety because you eventually probably will be found out. So it's better to come clean. It's better to deal with it, put it out on the table, and get a clear conscience again. I heard this statement. You've maybe heard it as well. It says, a clear conscience makes for a soft pillow. In other words, you can sleep a lot better when you have a clear conscience. If you're holding things back, if you're afraid of getting caught, if you're doing misconduct or lies or whatever, you're probably going to have some anxiety. Wow. So what about you? I mentioned there's certain situations that I tend to be anxious about when I get overloaded, overextended, and I can't meet my commitments or deadlines. But what about you? Are there certain situations that often cause you unusual stress and anxiety? We all kind of have different things that trigger us, and maybe you have some that particularly trigger you. And then the other question is, are there proactive steps you can take to eliminate some of the stress and anxiety? Sometimes we can look ahead and say, look, it's going to be a tough time, a stressful time. I'm going to have a lot going on in the next month, and you can plan ahead, and sometimes that really helps a whole lot. Well, what are the other solutions? How do you remedy anxiety? Well, that's a big question. We could have a whole book on that one. There's a lot of books been written. For some people, they need medication. I'm not a big fan of medication because I think it most of the time it's only good to relieve the symptoms, and it's most of the time only good in the short run. But some people chemically, at least for a while, need some medication. I realize even in myself, I'm not on any medication like that, but I realize that junk food, if I eat enough junk food, it causes more anxiety. Why is that? Well, I don't know. Chemically, eating all that junk food, I tend to be more uptight, more nervous, more anxious. I don't know. I don't know why that is, but it's a chemical kind of thing. So keep that in mind. It might be that you need to change buses or change the seat in the bus. You say, I hate this job I've been in. I got to do something else. This isn't really working for me. I'm not good at this. I don't like this. And you might need to change the bus or change the seat on the bus. You might need to get some counseling or therapy or coaching to help you change your perspective in the situation. See, sometimes it's not just a matter of changing the situation. It's a matter of changing how we perceive the situation. And a good counselor, a good coach, a good therapist, whatever you want to call them, a good friend, maybe just have a friend, can help you see what's good, what's bad, what needs to change. They can spot things that somehow we have blind spots we don't always see. I also just want to encourage you. I'm a pastor at heart, and I want to encourage you to read the Bible. There's biblical solutions, like Philippians chapter 4 is a great chapter in the Bible where the Apostle Paul was in prison. He was in jail, and here's some of the things he said to the Philippians in chapter 4 of that book. He said, rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. And basically that's talking about gratitude. You say, well, how can you rejoice in prison? How can you rejoice in these difficult circumstances? Well, there's something about choosing joy, choosing gratitude, choosing to give thanks to God. The other thing he said in verse 6, he says, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God. Well, basically in that is he's saying, pray. If you're anxious, cast your burdens on the Lord, it says in other places. I think it's Psalm 55, it's 1 Peter 5. Cast your burdens on the Lord and he will sustain you. We need to learn how to offload our concerns and put them on the Lord. And then he says the things that are good, pure, lovely, and good report, think on these things. In other words, we need to change our mentality, change our focus. I think I shared that in one of my other videos, but here, this time I got a prop here. This is a radio, right? And so, here it is.
Brett Whipple Show, it is great to be with you. 745. Brett.
So anyway, what's the point of that? Well, the point of that is that if you don't like the channel, you can change it. You know, there's a lot of static in this, particularly in this radio, this AM radio here, but you can change the channel. Romans chapter 8 talks about that. Set your mind on the Spirit instead of the flesh. You can change the channel. And it takes some discipline, but you have to stop grumbling and complaining and say, Lord, I want to be on your channel instead of on the stress, anxiety channel. And then lastly, Paul said in Philippians chapter 4, he said, I've learned the secret. Learned the secret? What secret? He said, I've learned the secret of contentment. Boy, oh boy, don't you wish you had a book on that? There probably are some books on that, by the way. But here's Paul in prison, and he says, you know what? I've learned the secret. I've learned the secret. Sometimes everything's going great. Sometimes it's not going so great. But whatever circumstances I'm in, I've learned to be at peace. I've learned to be content. Wow. That is an incredible principle. You don't have to have everything perfect in your life before you can be content or happy. You have to, again, accept the things you can't change the things you can, have the wisdom to know the difference. Well, lastly, before we close here, this is a ball, and it's an inflatable ball, but in this case, it's not fully inflated. And here's the principle. The cares of life will squeeze you. They will put pressure on you. The fears, the anxieties, the cares, the financial needs, the physical needs, they will try to squeeze and push you down and to mold you into their mold. But here's the key. You need to have an internal life. You need to be fully inflated by the Holy Spirit. And so if you feel like the cares of life are just pushing you around, say, Lord, fill me with your Spirit. I want to be surrendered to you. I want to be filled up on the inside so that all the pressure on the outside is not going to do me in. Wow. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this, friends. And remember, one day at a time. I think you're going to make it till midnight. I will. And God bless you, and see you next time.